Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 1859 novel by Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. The 12th novel by English novelist, writer, literary genius, I suppose, Charles Dickens. A Tale of Two Cities. This is a work that has a reputation that precedes itself. This novel is arguably Dickens' most famous, which is saying a lot for a guy who also wrote Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, David Copperfield, etc., etc. And additionally, if you were to look at the best-selling books of all time list, if we exclude religious texts like the Bible, the Quran, etc., etc., Tale of Two Cities is at least in contention for being the best-selling book of all time, if not actually being at the #1 list. Wikipedia's list has it at #1 currently. So certainly there's a heavy reputation here. But before we talk about that, just to kind of strip things back and go to when Dickens actually wrote it and the context for when he wrote it. This, of course, came out, A Tale of Two Cities came out tail end of the 1850s, a decade where after David Copperfield, Dickens had really sort of stretched his literary wings into these sort of darker territories and released a bunch of novels that most people probably would not rate as among his absolute most popular works of all time, but certainly they have their respect. Bleak House, a novel that I was not crazy about, but certainly a lot of people have talked about as being one of the best written Dickens novels. Hard Times, Little Dorrit, which I really liked. No, again, novels that are not generally considered to be among the absolute most popular things he ever did or the most commercially successful things that he ever did, but still obviously have their place. And Dickens appears to have, made a very intentional pivot with A Tale of Two Cities into trying to focus on the theme of the historical novel. Now, historical fiction is something that Dickens has, tapped into, I think, several times in the sense that he's had historical settings for his books, but the settings are not really the focus. They're just kind of a backdrop for everything else. But you have, as far as historical novels go, only Barnaby Rudge in the Dickens canon, aside from A Tale of Two Cities. Now, Barnaby Rudge I reviewed about a year or so ago now, and that to this day is still a contender for my least favorite Dickens novel. I just wasn't crazy about the pacing of that one. But to its credit, I think what I can say is that book, I think, really uses its historical setting very well and manages it in a very efficient way as a plot device in general. So that's a plus. We know that Dickens can do that genre well. And A Tale of Two Cities, which is a book that there's a couple of different origin points. There was a Wilkie Collins play that Dickens helped co-write and even acted in. And then just Dickens' own personal experiences, of course, as we've come to expect. The setting of A Tale of Two Cities is ripe for literary inspiration. It's the French Revolution. And of course, you think about that opening line that Dickens writes in the book. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, etc., etc. One of the most famous opening lines in all of literature. And, Dickens is intentionally trying to, at the beginning, create this sort of dichotomy, this sort of duality, I suppose, between the two cities that he names in the title. Now, at first, your impression is going to be, okay, well, those two cities are going to be Paris and London because those are the cities where the novel is set in. It's where most of their characters are from. And that tracks, and I think that is the intention. But I think there is also a second level to this that becomes more and more apparent as time goes on, and which makes complete sense given the French Revolution setting. And that is the relationship between the upper class and the lower class, specifically in Paris, and specifically in connection with the French Revolution, obviously, and how the bourgeoisie, as it were, the upper class, were revolted against by the lower class, and how that affected things, and how that results in characters in this novel paying the price. Characters in this novel, one character in particular, the character of Darnay, who is a member of the French upper class, the aristocracy, and after the revolution ends up paying the price and being retaliated against, and it becomes this whole major plot device during the last part of the book, which we'll get to. But that dynamic, I think, is also what Dickens really wants to accomplish. Like, that is the distinction between upper class Paris and lower class Paris. Now, we've set up this book, and we've set up a book that, full transparency, I think is fantastic. But I will say that this was not, I don't necessarily know that this is going to be a contender for my favorite Charles Dickens novel. And I will acknowledge that this is entirely my own limitations, as it were, and my own preferences kind of coming into things. But I really value Dickens as a humorist and as a satirist. I think that is the strong point of almost every Charles Dickens novel out there. And Tale of Two Cities, it's not devoid of humor. There are funny moments in here, but it does not leave as much time for them as other Dickens novels do. And that's by design. This isn't a very efficiently paced novel, one of the best paced Dickens novels, maybe the best paced Dickens novel. There's not much time for frivolity, I guess. And I mean, the situation, there's always stakes at hand in this novel, and there's always the chance of someone getting killed or imprisoned or both, and you feel those stakes right from the beginning, right? The Bastille and the image of prison and the guillotine, execution, murder. It's all of this is in the background. And you can't really, you don't have much opportunity to detour from that, to deviate from that into some sort of little sketch where Dickens gets to stereotype a segment of Parisian society or British society or what have you. So they don't happen super often. And again, to me, that is one of the elements that makes Dickens who he is that humor and that satire piece of it. So to not have that as much is a little bit disappointing. But I think what it does is it speaks very strongly to Dickens' willingness to try different things in this work, to attempt a very different approach as far as story structure, setting up characters, and everything related to those two things. As far as the characters go, I don't know that I would qualify or classify this as Dickens' strongest bunch of characters. I think this is a very plot-driven novel as opposed to a character-driven piece, at least for a big chunk of it. But I do think that the dynamic between the character of the Doctor is interesting, and how the Doctor is this through line, this catalyst for almost everything that happens throughout the whole book. And the dichotomy between Darnay and Carton, the two male characters who end up being involved in this, what I think is by definition a love triangle type of situation, but really isn't treated as such for very long. and how Darnay and Carton are both very different characters, but there's also overlap in the sense that it seems like they understand each other on some level. I don't know. It's people talked about how those two characters are Dickens, meaning Dickens' way of representing like two sides of his own personality and that sort of thing, which I think would very much track. And of course, again, Darnay and Carton, you have the Paris versus London dynamic with those two characters. And then you have the moment at the end that, of course, is the one character saving another type of situation. And, you know, speaking about the ending, because how could you not? The ending of this novel is as famous, roughly, as the beginning. It's a novel it's a novel that seems to end in a manner that would be befitting of a Hollywood movie because of how dramatic and how emotional and powerful it is. The idea of the heroic sacrifice and that sort of thing. And, you know, I think this novel in general, I think the last like 100 or so pages of it, the entire third book, as it were, really, to me, is what elevates this into classic Dickens territory for me. I think everything ahead of it is excellent, but it's really how this thing ramps up when the storming of the Bastille happens and everything connected to that plot, and how it affects all the characters and the sort of huge climax to this thing. All of that is what elevates this to classic, one of Dickens' greatest novels territories. And, you know, reflecting on it, I probably would feel pretty comfortable saying that this is the best ending to any Dickens novel. I can't think of another one that really competes with it. It's emotional, it's affecting. Dickens, who writes superbly throughout this entire novel, again, very economical prose. Again, he's not really delving into humor, but is very like firm, like descriptive, to the point, sharp writing throughout. I think the emotions of the climax pull out some of Dickens' best work. And again, especially that last line, which again is another one that everyone talks about, but I think is just so beautifully written. So yeah, just a gorgeous bit of evocative description. So yeah, A Tale of Two Cities is a novel that, as I said, its reputation precedes itself, and I don't think anyone would come into this expecting me to say, don't read it, I don't recommend it, it sucks, X, Y, or Z. I obviously recommend it. It's fantastic. It's definitely one of Dickens' better novels, even if I'm not necessarily sold on it being my number one. But what I will say, because I'm sure most people, you know, I take a step back, I think a lot of people probably have had their start, their introduction to Dickens with A Tale of Two Cities, which makes sense if it's his most popular novel. But what I will say is, if you are one of those people and you are planning on starting with A Tale of Two Cities, or if you already have, just know, I do think the piece about humor and the fact that this novel doesn't have a ton of it says something. And I think that means something. And I think if you want to really appreciate Dickens in all of his many qualities, I think you should complement this book with another novel of his. Maybe that's Oliver Twist. You keep it short and you do, again, another very recognizable character. That novel, I think, has a lot more of Dickens' satirical side to him. Maybe you do David Copperfield, another one with a great plot, but I think has a little bit more room for those kind of plot deviations. I would hate for people to read this novel and not pick up another Dickens novel and not really appreciate how important the satire and the humor is to his writing and to his reputation as a writer. So But I don't think anyone would be poorly served by starting with A Tale of Two Cities by any means. I think it holds its classic status for a reason. I think there's fantastic writing here. I think the characters are certainly good enough to support the story. And I think, again, as far as settings go, there's hardly anything more compelling than those few years in late 18th century France. So what can I say? It's A Tale of Two Cities. Highly recommend it. Really grateful to have finally read it for the first time, and I'm very curious to know what other people think of it, so let me know down in those comments. With that, thanks so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.